live music capital of the world, there was an assumption about certain kinds of music and certain genres of music that certainly get more attention and get more money, and even, unfortunately, I'll probably also have a little bit more of a fan base. But however, Austin is a great city for all kinds of music, literally all kinds of music. There is a pocket for every kind of music in this city, and one of the things that I've had the symphony on a couple of times, spoken to Maestro Peter Bay and a few other people from the organization to talk about the work that they do and the music that they put out. But I think one of the issues with that kind of music is that it tends to lend itself to an older crowd, and if you don't know the music or don't know anything about it, it's hard to jump in there and get your hands dirty and become a fan. However, though, one of the things that's changing along those lines, and I even have a story of my own about it here that I'll tell in a second, is video game music. And I don't think that that is something that is thought about in the same vein, in the same genre as a lot of symphonic or classical works, but it is the same kind of music. And I think anybody out there who's ever listened to classical music knows that it sort of puts you in a place, it gives you these grand feelings, and that's exactly what video game and even movie scores are supposed to do. They're supposed to elicit an emotion. And so here to talk about on Inside Austin that and many other things is Andy Brick, who is the guest conductor for the upcoming show at the Austin Symphony Orchestra called Game On. It is happening Friday, January 24th at the Long Center, 7:30. If you would like tickets, go to austinsymphony.org. First of all, sorry for my long-winded open, but welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm very, very much looking forward to this conversation because I told you I had a story to tell, and that is that I was listening to some, it was like some music to have on in the background during a family event, and different generations. There was the older grandparents, parents, and then my generation, and then the kids of my generation were all there, and music was playing on, I think it was Pandora or something like that, just some classical station, and one of the kids goes, "Hey, this is..." Unfortunately, I forget the name of the game. He goes, "This is such and such video game music." And I got all gatekeepy and old and everything and said, "No, it's not. They wouldn't play this on a classical station. That's, that I'm sorry, but that's just," and I pick it up, the device, and I look at it, and I was wrong. I think, unfortunately, that's sort of the idea, is that this is given a backseat to the fact that there's like legitimate classical music, and then there's the others, when that just really is not the case.
Yeah, I think there is a stereotype and a genre classification that puts certain genres in, as you called it, the backseat of orchestral music, and I think that is a result of, 200 years of orchestral history following a certain protocol, which, with the advent of technological-oriented media like film and video games, has seen new and different horizons. For example, I think it's hard to have a conversation today about the symphony orchestra and the appeal to the masses without mentioning the name John Williams, the eminent and perhaps greatest film composer of all time. And I do think that John Williams sort of set a new direction for the symphony orchestra, where they could present music which was already familiar to an audience that was unfamiliar with the symphony orchestra. And that's really important, because I think once you get acclimated to the symphony orchestra, once you get introduced to this amazing body of 100 musicians who are all playing together to make this beautiful art, once you get to be part of that world, it's easy to stay. You fall in love with it, and it becomes part of your music consumption. But the real trick is, how do you win the attention of somebody who doesn't necessarily have that insight? How do you get a 16-year-old into the concert hall? How do you get a 25-year-old into the concert hall? And I think John Williams specifically, was the first to do that. And then I think, because of the nature of the media, of video games as a media, it has an even greater pull on an even larger audience. And so I think that video game music has been able to assist and foster that new generation of symphonic concert goers. And I think another important, I guess, matter of terminology, if I may, is that instead of calling it a symphony, maybe we should just call it orchestral music, because we're really referring to the music that's being played by a symphony orchestra. And orchestral music then can kind of help us to dissipate the preconceived notions of genre. And that, that becomes part of what I think might be a block to attracting audiences of all generations into the symphony hall.
I wholeheartedly agree, actually, because like when you just said that, I thought to myself, is there a difference between symphonic and orchestral music? If there is, I don't know the difference, because I don't necessarily know the difference between like classical and Baroque and all the other little idiosyncrasies within a bigger genre. And I think people have that same issue with jazz music, where if you have absolutely no place to start and no information of the source material, it's impossible to know where to get started. It is such a wash of, you've heard the names in classical music. You've heard Beethoven and you've heard Mozart and Chopin and all these other very famous people and composers. But you may not be able to actually put one of their pieces to the name, and that is one of the problems that the genre has, is that it is so big, it is so daunting if you are completely ignorant to the source information, that I think that exactly as you said, there is a quit before you even start kind of thing. And that's why this conversation seemed really interesting to me, is because I think that video games have done exactly as you said. They have given an interest to a new crowd of musicians, even hopefully in the future, but a new crowd of music lovers that never would be introduced to this music if it weren't for having video games or movies and television to present it to them.
Absolutely. And not only never introduced to the music, but never introduced in a way that no other genre introduces orchestral music to a new generation. Let me break that down for you. So, we have the beloved Mahler, Beethoven, Stravinsky, Debussy, just named by 4 top composers of the orchestral world. And if you are exposed to that music, there's a good chance that somewhere in there you're going to fall in love with it. But if you're not exposed to that music, you're just not going to know. What I think has happened with video games is that it's not just that there's orchestral music and really good orchestral music that lies within the video games, but it's the way that the music's being presented. And what that is that the music is part of the gameplay. So there's a visceral, physical engagement that the game player is having while listening to this music. And that makes the consumption of the music for the player also a visceral experience. So there's this, if you think about it in real terms, like you're behind a controller. Maybe it's a handheld controller. Maybe you've got a controller device, but there's something in your hands, most likely, that's controlling the gameplay. So there's a physical interaction, and you've got music, and maybe the music is like blaring French horns that are really starting to get your adrenaline going, and your hands are moving because you're moving the controller, and your heart rate might be going up. So there's all of these physical reactions that you're having while you're listening to this music. And what happens is you get not only the emotional tied to the music that you would if you were listening to Mahler or Stravinsky, but you get this very physical connection to the music. And I think that creates a bond to the player with the music that doesn't exist in any other genre.
What also gives them an actual association with the music also is they're doing really well in the video game and just conquered a level or beat a boss or something like that, and the music was really cool and intense at the same time. All of those things get remembered as once. It goes down as one big overall feeling, and that is one of the most amazing things about music is it hits all of these emotions and these other tactile, in this case, actual feelings too that are involved with it. It's one of the best examples of that. Is the other side of that is everybody out there listening at some point or another has had their music collection ruined by their significant other that they just broke up with and had a shared musical taste with. We've all gone through that, and it took years to be able to revisit that music. And it's amazing how music has such an intense emotion attached to it. And I think that is absolutely no different.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that connection to the gameplay and, achieving a certain goal or reaching a new level, it just goes even further to create the bond between the player and the music. And when you translate that into a live situation, like what we're going to do with the Austin Symphony Game On Friday, creates an audience that is really enthusiastic about the music because they're having some kind of recollection of a moment, whether it be that physical recollection that I mentioned before, or whether it be a recollection of the gameplay. For example, back in 2020, just before COVID arrived, I premiered Game On with the National Symphony of the United States at the Kennedy Center. And one of the local media outlets there was doing some interviews with some people after the concert. And the person said, "Oh, yeah, I overheard somebody saying, oh, I remember that moment in the game at the moment that they heard the music." So there is that connection. And I think it creates a really special bond between not just the player and now the audience member and the music, but hopefully, and what I hope to do and achieve is to create that bond between the player and the orchestra, or even if you drill down more, the player and that trumpet player who just played that line that the game player has loved for years.
We are talking to Andy Brick, who is the guest conductor for the Austin Symphony Orchestra. He just mentioned the upcoming show on Friday, January 25th is Game On. For tickets, go to austinsymphony.org. And you actually have a big hand in not just composing some of this music, because you are a composer in addition to being a conductor, but you actually have a big hand in popularizing this music. And I apologize for using the term, but legitimizing it even. You are the one that has pioneered getting an orchestra to play this kind of music, getting together and understanding the importance of this music simply from a music standpoint.
Yeah, sure. And there's quite a story behind that. I mean, it's not just that we're doing the concert on Friday, the 24th of January with the Austin Symphony, but it's that this is the culmination of a 25-year evolution of symphonic game music. So I was, as you said, I was actually one of the really early video game composers. In fact, there's a very funny story that I tell. I started out as a film composer, and I had won this award back when I was in my early 30s for film music. And part of the award was to go to Hollywood and score some music on a Fox Newman's Town Stage, which is the same place that John Williams scored Star Wars, I believe. And so I went there and I did that, and I met with all sorts of fancy Hollywood people. Then I decided to come back to New York. I didn't want to stay in Hollywood because I really felt like I was a New Yorker. So I came back to New York, and when I got back to New York, a friend of mine said to me, "Do you want to write music for a game?" Now, this was the mid-1990s. So I was like, "A game? What do you mean?" And I literally thought that my friend meant that they were going to bring out a Monopoly board and that I was going to be writing music that somehow would play when you moved the shoe around the board or something like that. I had no idea what a video game was. So, I had grown up with arcades, so I knew what Pac-Man was, but to have it contextualized as a game in that setting was unfamiliar to me.
Just to interject real quick, and that's that also video game music back then was do 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 do, and it wasn't music, it was computer generated sounds. It wasn't the same thing as it is what has it evolved to now. So I can completely understand why that never would have occurred to you is that they weren't using live instrumentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a name for that type of music. It's called chiptunes. But yes, part of it was that I just wasn't a chiptune person. I didn't know that genre of music. So I said, okay, sure. It looks cool. He sort of explained to me what the job entailed. And I did the game. And the game was for this guy by the name of Rick Dyer, who in the history of video games is a pretty well-known game developer. And the game was pretty successful. And so then I did another one for that guy, and then another one for a different person. And all of a sudden, after a couple of years, I guess it's about 2003 now, I was doing a game for a game developer in Europe. And one of the producers there said to me, "Hey, do you want to conduct a concert of symphonic game music?" And I thought, that sounds really cool. So this was 22 years ago. And I said, that sounds really, really cool. Let's do that. And so we got the Czech National Symphony Orchestra, and we got them into the Gewandhaus. And I'll never forget the first rehearsal. I walked into the orchestra, and there were 100 or so musicians sitting there, and they're all looking at me like, what are we doing here? Why are we sitting here for video game music? Isn't it exactly what you just said? Isn't it all da-da-da-dum? This chiptune kind of stuff. And I explained to them that it wasn't all chiptune music, and that the stuff that was really famous at that time, which might have been, we had converted for the symphony orchestra, or as we say in the industry, we had orchestrated for the symphony orchestra. And I told them that I really believed that we had an opportunity to tap into a new audience. And they were sort of friends of mine at the time, that orchestra, still are. And so they kind of bought into it. And we arrived at the Gewandhaus in Leipzig, Germany for this concert, and it was sold out. And the audience went absolutely crazy. And so that was the very first time that a symphonic video game music concert had ever been done in the Western world. And so that sort of started the genre of symphonic game music concerts in 2003. And then I did a tour. I did that until 2007. We did them regularly. And then in 2007, we brought a similar kind of production to the United States, which ran until 2012. And then around 2014, I was asked to create my own game music concert and what I thought a game music concert should and could be. And at that time, in 2014, I didn't really think it was the right time to present that kind of a thing. So I passed. But then in 2018, I really started to think about, like, what would I do if I were going to do a symphonic game music concert? And there were a couple of things that I wanted to do. The one thing that I really wanted to do is I wanted to present the world of video game music in a really diverse way. So everybody knows the big French horn anthems and the big action adventure music, and that's amazing, wonderful music. But there's a lot of other really cool video game music out there. So I wanted to make sure that we had a diverse program that could really touch the audience and really interest the audience. But at the same time, I wanted to make it something that the orchestra could really sink their teeth into, something that they would really be engaged in playing, because if your orchestra is not into it, then it's really not going to come off very well. So I set down this path. It was about a 2-year development path to contact a bunch of friends of mine in the video game industry and get together an original program of 16 titles, which had all of the big hits. And we went ahead and created Game On with those 16 titles, premiered it, at least one of the most historic venues in the United States, the Kennedy Center, with the National Symphony, who of course just did a bang up job playing it. And we were off to the races. And now we're going into our 5th year, but also includes COVID. So really 3rd year of doing concerts. And, we've got a catalog now of 25 pieces, which includes some of the greatest symphonic game music that's out there. We'll be doing in Austin, we'll be doing like The Witcher 3, World of Warcraft, Ori. We're going to do Skyrim from the Elder Scrolls, Assassin's Creed, Guild Wars 2. But we're also going to do some really new titles, like one of the newest and probably one of the games that has taken the world by storm more than any other in probably a decade or so is Baldur's Gate 3. And we're going to do the world premiere of that in Austin. So it's been an evolution. But I think where we've come is really great.
This coming up Friday at 7:30 at the Long Center is Game On. And joining me on Inside Austin is Andy Brick, who is the guest conductor for the Austin Symphony Orchestra. If you would like more information on the upcoming show, if you would like to check out tickets, please go to austinsymphony.org. And if you'd like more information on Andy's work, please go to andybrick.com. I think that you sort of touched on something there towards the end, and that is that I know that, like, when I was a kid and growing up, I didn't know that there was something that was classical or symphonic music that was new. I thought that that was something that came from hundreds of years ago, and they no longer were making that kind of music. And it took me through, I probably movie scores where I realized that there is still that sort of, and growing up, I'm a mid-70s baby, so John Williams is right in my wheelhouse. So of course, being exposed to all of that in the various movies, not just Star Wars. What has he been nominated for? Something like 50 Oscars or something like that. It's the list of movies that he has been a part of is phenomenal. And so it's one of those things where this is an amazing opportunity for people who have not been exposed, have not been, maybe have misunderstood the genre, to be able to see it through a completely different lens. But also, I think if you're a symphony lover, if you're someone who loves that kind of music, this is a great way to get introduced to new kinds of and new compositions of your favorite kind of music.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a couple of things there that I really want to talk about. Gosh, I don't know where to start. Let me start with the last thing that you kind of pointed at and work backwards, which was that it's a good opportunity for the regular symphony goer to experience new symphonic music. And that's really, really true, and very true in a profound way that I don't think most people realize. So let me throw a statistic at you. The average age of a gamer is 36. The average distribution between male and female gamers is about 55% male, 45% female. So almost a completely even split. The fastest growing segment of the video game world is 50-year-old plus and older. And I think what that's pointing to when we start to look at it within a musical context is, if we take the composition of the symphony orchestra audience, there's this stereotype, rightly or wrongly, that the symphony orchestra has a lot of regular audience members who maybe are like me and have some graying hair, right? However, there's a whole new generation of gamers who are not only approaching that stereotypical audience profile, but are playing as a connection to their kids and to their grandkids. And because they're playing as a connection to their kids and their grandkids, all elements of that medium of game is being connected. So a 50-year-old, 55-year-old, or somebody like me who's approaching 60, who would go and see Stravinsky in a heartbeat, the Austin Symphony, I would love, but who also plays video games with their son, now sees a concert of symphonic music with the Austin Symphony, that's game music, and says to their son, check this out. They're playing the music from Baldur's Gate 3, and we've been playing that together for the past month. So yeah, it is an opportunity for the symphony audience to be exposed to new music, but it's also an opportunity for the symphony, for the orchestra itself, to get not only those people that it would expect to get from an audience, from a new audience, but also to get sort of a secondary connection to a younger audience from those people. So that's one thing. The other thing, which I think you kind of hit upon, which I'd like to just take a second to talk about, and we alluded to it at the very beginning of this conversation, was the distinction between symphonic music and orchestral music. And it's kind of a same differentiation between the term classical music and orchestral music. And I think it's a matter of how the terminology hits the public. If I say classical music, somebody might think of Mahler. But in the real definition of what classical music is, from a musical logical standpoint, that's not Mahler. Mahler is not classical music. Mahler didn't exist during the classical period. So it's a slight misnomer, or perhaps this classification, to call it classical music, even if you're not talking about film music or game music. So I think if we just refer to it as orchestral music, what we're doing then is we're saying, okay, here's a body of musicians that we call an orchestra. And an orchestra tends to consist of a whole bunch of string instrument players with a bunch of woodwind players, a bunch of brass players, percussionists, maybe choirs we have, and you've got this thing called an orchestra. So if we recontextualize things and say, okay, this is orchestral music, then we're not making this assumption that it's classical music, which in reality would refer to Beethoven and Mozart. And we're not making an assumption that it's the sort of pseudonym for classical music, which just encompasses, everybody from Mahler to Stravinsky to Debussy and others that are not part of the classical period. But it now opens up this body of amazing musicians like the Austin Symphony to being part of the musical repertoire of the current generation. And I can't tell you how important I think that is. It's much more likely that a 25-year-old is going to put on something that is orchestral music that they don't know about than it is putting on something that is classical music that they don't know about.
And I think, and we're talking to Andy Brick, who is a composer and a conductor, and he will be the guest conductor at the Austin Symphony Orchestra coming up on this Friday, as a matter of fact, January 24th, at the at the Long Center. If you would like more information, go to austinsymphony.org. I think you bring up an excellent point, and I think maybe it's one of those things where, as I said, people don't necessarily know the difference. And when I say classical, it didn't even occur to me that, of course, that doesn't include things like John Williams, because classical, just by nature, has a certain age to it, just by the name of it. And so people do that. It's every rectangle is a square, but not every square is a rectangle kind of thing. And that's why it's nice talking to someone who actually knows the differences. I don't mind being corrected on that sort of thing. And there is a difference. Unfortunately, things like that do work, where the name of something is more likely to get you in the door or turn you off to it. And I think orchestral music does have a different, and as you clearly pointed out, a more accurate ring to it than calling something classical. But I also have to call just a little bit of my own thing. Is there was a classical music station down the hall from me at my very first radio job. And so I think kind of by default, I've always put that stuff under the name of what the radio station, which was, the classical voice of Denver.
Absolutely. And I think 90% of the people in this world do the same thing. I just really feel like, words matter and the terminology matters, and it seeps into the public consciousness. And if new symphonic music, whether it be new composers that are not writing for media, or whether it be composers that are writing for media, if that new orchestral music is to finding its way to the public in a manner that induces that public to come into the hall, I think we have to be able to present it in a way that creates that incentive, that bond from a person who's enjoying the music to the orchestra. And that terminology, orchestral music, I think makes it a safe place for that new audience to go.
Absolutely. And it also, classical implies that there's no chance of hearing anything new in a weird sort of way. And you know what, to be honest with you, you're somebody who has had their own hand in changing the genre itself, so you have every right to want to redefine what it's called based on the fact that these things do evolve. These things do need further classification and further correction and further definition as things do change. And so understanding the difference and making sure that you are calling something the right thing is kind of the least you can do in today's world when it comes to particularly talking to an expert who would like you to refer to it in a particular way. It's, you go ahead and do that.
Yeah, although I don't think that I want to say that I'm an expert and that I necessarily want anybody to refer to it in any specific way. I think what I'm trying to say is that, you go and you listen to jazz, and who's playing jazz? A jazz band is playing jazz. You go and you listen to rock and roll music. Who's playing rock and roll music? A rock music band is playing rock music. Why is it that when we listen to 100 acoustic instruments, the majority of which in any single category are strings, woodwinds, and brass, why is it that we don't refer to those as orchestral music, but instead give it this other term? And by giving it that other term, and maybe we're spending too much time on this because it seems to be getting very nitpicky, but maybe by calling it that other term, classical music, if you will, maybe it's misleading our audiences.
I think there's something to that. And nitpicking music genres is one of my favorite things to do in this world. I will argue and die on the hill that 80s music is a genre, not a time period. So it's one of those things where you sort of hit me right in my wheelhouse where, we get to classify something and nitpick on the details. So I do apologize.
I'm going to go off topic here just for a second because you mentioned that. So I had my birthday last June, and we were driving up to go kayaking, my son and my wife and I, and it was like an hour and a half or 2 hour drive to get to the place we were going. And so I thought it would be fun to play the number one hit single from the year I was born, 1965, until the current year. And we had just about the time to do it. So we did. And every generation or every decade had amazing music. The 60s, 70s. We get into the 80s, and it definitely was a genre of so there's no doubt about it.
Thank you for agreeing, because most people disagree. Most people will say that, oh, no, it's definitely a time period. Like, so you consider the very late 80s hair band music, you put that in the same category as you would like Erasure and I'm sorry, 80s music, when I hear that, I think what is now kind of called post-punk or new wave music, those sorts of things. And so thank you for agreeing with me. People will just, it's a lump of things. And because you don't say 70s music, you don't say 60s music, you refer to genres and you refer to time periods a little bit differently. But when you say 80s music, everybody pictures big hair and mascara.
For sure. And I've got a theory as to why that is.
Please.
So my theory is this, and I think it spans a bunch of genres, including video game music, including orchestral music. And my theory is technology. I think in the 80s was the first time that music technology came to the masses, right? Like there was stuff in the 70s, and if we're going to talk just popular music, in the 70s, we had like the Fairlight and, these other synthesizers that were like $200,000 each in the 70s, right? They were super expensive. And if you had music which was in any way generated or driven by any kind of technological device, the device was prohibitively expensive.
And you also couldn't move it.
We got to the 80s and you couldn't move it, right? It wasn't portable. When we got to the 80s, this thing called MIDI arrived. And MIDI, which stands, it's an acronym for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. MIDI allowed people to interface synthesizers with computers and kind of created a new communications protocol for electronic music devices. And in the 80s, it was the first time that popular artists and jazz artists as well, and even the very genesis of orchestral music that included this technology happened in the 80s. It was the first time that it came to the public. And I think there was a learning curve. So in the 80s, what we saw was a lot of experimentation with the technology to see where it was going to fall in the lexicon of musical instruments and musical vocabulary. And for a while, it was a bumpy road. Artists didn't always know how to approach it. I can tell you from my own experience as a composer at the time, there was this thing, and this would have been probably either at the very end of the 80s or the early 90s. There was a synthesizer called the Proteus. And the Proteus was the first synthesizer that could actually emulate orchestral instruments in a way that was somewhat convincing and was at a price point that virtually anybody could afford that had a serious interest in it. And what happened was you got a lot of people like myself who went through a traditional kind of training, although my path was slightly different, but, did the whole conservatory routine, who had this background, but didn't have an outlet for their creative expression because the outlet required a symphony orchestra. And that was very hard and still is very hard for a new composer to get a performance in. And so we turned to these electronic devices in the late 80s and early 90s to emulate it. And to a certain extent, it became a learning process, but perhaps even more importantly, an interactive creative process where we were discovering what orchestral sounds and combinations and textures we like and what they would mean from an emotional standpoint. So the 80s really, I think there was something special. It was definitely a turning point where technology infiltrated a number of different musical genres. So calling the 80s a musical genre in and of itself, to me, is not such a bad idea.
I just want to clarify for somebody. I am not a musician. I say this all the time, but I have a little bit of an understanding, have been friends with many musicians, and have quite frankly had the privilege to interview many like Andy. And when he was talking, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when he was talking about having MIDI technology and having the ability to be able to synthesize music, is now you were able to play as someone who could play the piano. Now you could hear what every single other instrument was based on you punching it up on your synthesizer, based on it turning your keyboard into those instruments. And it may not have sounded perfect, but you could get a better idea of what all of these combined sounds were. And as recording technology started to blossom as well, not just digital recording, but having the ability to record on multiple tracks and being able to hear these things as you're composing them, that really did. It made studios not like they are kind of now, where people can just do that sort of stuff in their closet, but it made it a lot more accessible to the average person.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what it was. It was a question of accessibility. I went to a pretty conservative music school, and coming out of that music school with a really solid traditional music training, you look for opportunities to get performances of your music and to stand in front of an orchestra. And those opportunities are few and far between. And then all of a sudden, this technology exists where this stuff that you've written down on paper, which is just waiting to find that string quartet or find that, orchestra to get a performance, can now at least be realized. And it wasn't perfect, and it still isn't perfect, but it provides a mechanism of feedback where you can sit down, you can hear what you've been thinking about and what you hear in your head. You can actually hear it physically, and that gives you a sense of feedback. And I think that's one really important for somebody who's pursuing it on a professional level, but also it'll allow somebody who is, for lack of better word, a hobbyist, to also participate in the creation process. And that's amazing. I mean, that's such a wonderful thing. And it allowed guys like me, once we were done with music school, to have a new path within the music industry. And that path, at least for me, interestingly enough, went right back to that organic institution of the Symphony Orchestra. So I started out from a very organic place, went to the electronics and the technology, and then saw it, worked with it, and turned back to the organic human experience of the Symphony Orchestra.
And we are talking to Andy Brick, who is a composer and a conductor, and he will be conducting the Austin Symphony Orchestra on this coming up Friday, 7:30 at the Long Center. For tickets or for more information, go to austinsymphony.org. You just brought up something that I definitely want to hit on, and that is you seeing electronic music, MIDI, the technology as a tool is probably in direct correlation to you understanding how video game music can also be put into this same category. It's seeing things as a tool, not as a hindrance. It's understanding that this is just now a part of the process, and you can either embrace it or you can become old and a has-been, or however you want to see it. It is one of those things where you seem like you have always understood accepting the new, accepting the change, and just being able to work within it.
Yeah, I didn't fight it. That's for sure. I've always approached it, though, as a very double-edged sword. It's especially when you're talking about acoustic instruments and writing for symphony orchestra, it's a double-edged sword. I was a university professor of music for a number of years, quite a while, actually. And I taught orchestration at the university. And when my students would orchestrate, I would insist that they do it without any technology, without any devices, that they sit down with a piece of paper and just write out the orchestration on a score paper for what they think they're hearing in their head before they heard any feedback from any kind of technology that would in some way create a representation of the actual sound. Because I think it's hugely important that before you get feedback from something that isn't a human being playing an instrument, but is instead trying to recreate it, you have a good sense in your head of what that human being playing that instrument is going to sound like. So that when you hear the technology do it, you have the wherewithal to say, okay, but that's not really what's going to happen. Or that's not really what that instrument sounds like in that particular register. Or by the way, that instrument can't really mix with that other instrument in that particular range at that particular dynamic level. So for me, it's been a double-edged sword. You really, really have to be careful. I can tell you that some of the best music that I've written at a desk with a piece of paper and a pencil. Well, now I do it with a keyboard going directly into a music notation software program, but essentially writing it old school with pencil and paper, because if you're lucky, if you're going to work within an orchestral context, it's really important to be able to hear it in your head and not rely on the technology, because the technology is not a human and you're writing for humans.
I think you bring up an excellent point, and I don't want to say that there is a big distinction as far as the amateur or the enthusiast versus the professional, but in some cases there are, particularly when you're trying to write music for an orchestra to actually play versus someone who does sit with their computer and writes music for their own pleasure or for a smaller audience, and that is you need to learn to do it right before you can use the technology as a tool. That the technology is a tool. It's not replacing anything. It's the same thing that AI is supposed to be. It's like that meme that goes around on social media. AI was supposed to do my dishes and my taxes for me while I went and created art and saw music, not create music and art, so that way I can do the dishes it's one of those things where it is supposed to be a tool. It's like we face the same thing here in radio, where there are DJs and commercials and all that stuff that are run through AI. And I think a lot of people who are using that technology are using it right in the sense that they're using it as a tool. But I think there's also a bigger group of people that are using it for a lack of having to pay a human being. And it takes, exactly as you said, when it comes to music, it takes the humanity out of it. It takes the human touch that we do have when it comes to things. And art is supposed to be started in that way. It isn't supposed to be easy.
It definitely takes some of the human touch out of it. I mean, if you're a composer and you're writing music and you've got this sound in your head and you want to get it out of your head into the physical world, there's a big creative human touch in that process. You're a person, you're a human being, and you're channeling something into the physical world. If that channeling goes to a whole bunch of electronics, fine. There's no robbing the human element there. If that realization of your humanity as a composer is being done by an electronic instrument, which is purposefully trying to imitate an acoustic instrument that would otherwise be played by a human being, and you're just losing the human element at that step. Now, that's a crucial step. I mean, as a conductor, you spend your life trying to hone in on that particular step and figure out how you're going to get the most out of this amazing body of musicians working together. So it's in no way diminishing that step. It could perhaps be the most important step, but there's multiple steps there. It's not a complete negation of the human experience in the music making process or the music realization process, but at some point there is a diminution of the human experience. And also, I'll say, one of the rough sides of that double-edged sword is that a lot of people use the electronics as a crutch, where instead of going through the process of hiring a live musician and learning that this or that can't happen and having to adjust and learn from that experience, the electronic music can do just about anything you want. I can give you a story. This is many years ago, I was scoring a film, and I wanted to write for a whole bunch of different guitars and harmonica and orchestral strings. And so I had a pretty decent sample synthesizer sound of a harmonica. And so I was doing this thing and I wrote the score and there was all this harmonica in it. And I brought in a harmonica player because I had a nice little budget to get some live players. So I brought in this really great, pretty well-known harmonica player. And as studio musicians and professional symphony orchestra musicians tend to do, they don't spend a whole lot of time with the music before the actual gig. You know, they're professionals. They've spent 30 years in a practice room reading music. They can do it. So the harmonica player comes in, he sits down, I put the music on his stand, and he looks at me and he goes, Andy, the harmonica is a mixolydian instrument. So essentially what he was saying to me was what I had written couldn't actually be played by a harmonica. I was able to make it sound like it was being played by a harmonica because the electronics let me do it. But the harmonica is not as straightforward as people might think. Now, this guy was an amazing harmonica player, perhaps one of the best in the United States. And he said to me, okay, let me take over this recording session and just do what I tell you to do. And for the remaining 3 hours, he had a suitcase of different harmonicas pitched in different mixolydian keys. And he would play like the first, third, and seventh note of the passage on one harmonica. And then we would stop the recording. We'd then go back and do an overdub, and he'd do the second and fourth and sixth notes on a different harmonica because those notes didn't exist on the first harmonica, and so forth. And this went on for 3 hours. And I was just thinking to myself, there's no way we're going to be able to stitch this together. But through the miraculous wonders of digital editing and music, we put together this amazing harmonica track that actually is impossible to play.
That sounds like the opera singing in The Fifth Element. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard the movie The Fifth Element, that the big, I'm not very familiar with the movie. I just remember seeing something about the big singing scene with the kind of blue creature that was overdubbing, and it's actually impossible for a human being to sing from one note to another and in that range.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one of the real dangers of technology, or one of that side of the double-edged sword. I mean, as great as the technology is, and as much as it levels the playing field for anyone to get into it and explore, and when it comes to orchestral music, to do it in a way that would otherwise not be available to them, the downside of it is that it's forgiving. Technology is forgiving in a way that the actual human being isn't. And not because the actual human being doesn't want to be forgiving, but they just can't do that. It's hard for a piccolo player to play in their very top register softly. It's almost impossible. And if you then take that same passage and you bring it to a synthesizer, you could make it the softest, sweetest, most delicate thing in the world. And it takes a lot of time and experience with real humans to begin to understand that nuance of acoustic instruments. So I think it's something we have to really approach carefully, and not just in music, but in all facets of our life. Technology is an interesting animal.
It's funny that you picked the piccolo. I had on the guy who put together the classical mystery tour, who was playing the character of John, was sort of the person who put it all together. And they also played with the Austin Symphony Orchestra. And he brought up the piccolo trumpet, about how in Sgt. Pepper's that note is so hard to hit, and the amount of breath that it takes to push it out is not the easiest thing to do. And so I think that's something that also, I'm not a singer or anything like that, but I've certainly belted out a tune or two in the shower, and it takes a lot of breath to go high.
There's all sorts of nuances of every single instrument. I mean, if you think about it, so as a conductor, I walk into this group of people. In the case of Game On, we'll have about 110 people on stage. And every single one of those people has been in a practice room, studying, practicing, playing, mastering their instrument for 20, 30, 40 plus years. And then you walk into that group as an individual, and you have the daunting responsibility of getting all of those experts to come together to create a singular vision of what we call music at hand, in the case of game on symphonic game music. And that's quite an accomplishment, because there's no way that I'm going to know the trumpet player's instrument as well as the trumpet player does. There's no way I'm going to know exactly what the right bowing is of the violins or the violas or the cello or the bassi as well as those guys do. It's a lifelong study that exists for everyone at different levels. The instrumentalists in the orchestra, it's a lifelong study of that single instrument. The composer who's writing for it, it's a lifelong study of how to create the music. The conductor, it's a lifelong story of how to create that emotive experience from that group.
I've talked to Maestro Peter Bay about something along those same lines, where each and every single one of those instruments sort of has their own little language to them. And as a conductor, you have to be able to not speak each language fluently, but you need to be able to know enough of it to get through. And that is one of the, from a complete outsider's point of view, that is one of the more amazing and harder things I would imagine to be as a conductor is that instead of putting that 10,000 hours of experience into that one thing, you put 500 hours of experience into 20,000 things. And so it's one of those things where the breadth of knowledge is different than an expert on it, but you still have more than just a working knowledge. And so it's got to be interesting. And we're talking to Andy Brick, who is the guest conductor for the Austin Symphony Orchestra's upcoming show, Game On, which is happening Friday, January 24th, 7:30 at the Long Center. If you want tickets, if you want more information, please go to austinsymphony.org. But if you would like more information on Andy himself, please go to andybrick.com. We were talking off the air real quick, and you said that your life has been consisting of traveling lately. Is playing with all of these different musicians, playing with all of these different orchestras. It's got to be rejuvenating in some way, but also very, very hard to walk into those situations regularly, to not have that sort of home group of, like Peter does, where he has his own orchestra and they kind of are the same group of people working together at a common goal. Is you've got to come in and sort of assimilate into a well-established room, and that can't be easy.
Thank you for bringing that up. It is so true, and it's one of the most challenging aspects of being a visiting conductor or a guest conductor, especially if you're a guy like me who travels all over the world doing this. I'll be in Austin on January 24th, and then on February 1st, exactly 1 week later, I'm in the UK playing with the Halle Orchestra, and then I'm off to Florida, Vancouver. We're going to the Middle East. We're going to be in Australia. All of this is going to happen within the course of 4 months, and every single group is different. Now, the language is more or less the same, but the approach to that language is quite different. So I can give you an example. The way that the Czechs, the folks in Czechia or the Czech Republic, approach the orchestra, the way that those players approach the orchestra is very different than the way that North American orchestra players approach the orchestra. And it's hard to describe, but there's a very different aesthetic that they bring to the orchestra. And being able to, one of the key elements of my job is being able to identify that quickly, try to understand where the orchestra is coming from as a body, and trying to connect to the individual players when I can. The other thing that is really challenging is you have a very limited amount of time with these players to show them exactly what the program consists of and then get them through that program. And it's not so much a matter of playing the notes. They can all play the notes. That's not really an issue. It's really a matter of explaining to them what we're trying to get out of those notes that they're playing. And there's not a whole lot of time to do that. So a lot of that explanation has to be through the body, which I think is one of the arts of conducting, especially for a guy who has very little time to actually talk to the orchestra. You have to express it with your body. You have to be able to communicate in nonverbal ways in real time. So that becomes a big challenge and a big part of the job. And then the other part of the job is just, troubleshooting. You're dealing with just real mechanics that can be quite daunting. For example, if you reprint a set of music and something happens in the process of printing it and there's a typo somewhere in one of the parts, you have to be able to hear it immediately and then tell the player exactly what is wrong in the part and how it should be corrected. It's a challenging but really engaging experience to be in the shoes that I get to be in. It's a real honor and it's a real privilege to play with these players because they all bring something really cool to the table and something which I think deserves an audience and deserves their local audience.
But it seems like that's sort of why this whole project, the Game On project and the video game music being brought to actual symphonies and to orchestras was to make it accessible, knowing that there was some untapped minds out there that needed to be addressed, and you knew that you could make the connection. And I have absolutely loved every minute of this conversation. This has been absolutely fascinating. We have gone way over time. So if you're listening to this on the radio, please, I definitely encourage you to go to odyssey.com or go to your favorite podcast platform and go ahead and catch the podcast version, because we'll have the full length conversation that we unfortunately will have to cut down a little bit. But if you are listening on the podcast, thank you. Go ahead and follow and like, or whatever your provider has as its option. We are talking to Andy Brick, who is the guest conductor for the Austin Symphony Orchestra's upcoming Game On performance. If you would like more information, if you would like tickets, please go to austinsymphony.org. If you would like to check out some more of the work that Andy has done, please go to andybrick.com. This Friday, January 24th, 7:30 at the Long Center. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your stories.
So, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the interest in not only Game On, but what I'm doing. And I'm really looking forward to visiting Austin and playing with the Austin Symphony. I really can't wait. I think it's going to be amazing.